Okay, we can start now then. Now I've got some tips. I can talk about this topic inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah amma ba'd. A'udhu billahi as-samir alim minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alamin. وقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بلغوا عني ولو آية. Respected brothers and those sisters who will be listening to this later on, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome you all to this very important topic. The topic of the day is the British Raj, Pakistan or India. How did we get here? How did we get here? Okay. History is a very important subject which we have collectively neglected criminally. The Muslims have today neglected their history to the extent that most of us, the overwhelming majority of us, are not aware of our basic history facts. If you were to walk into a masjid and ask people questions about basic history of Islam, including the life of the Prophet ﷺ, most Muslims will struggle to answer the question. And the irony is, our entire faith is based upon history. Our entire faith is based upon history, an appreciation of history, a study of history, and learning history. Because what is Islam? Islam is based upon precedent. Precedent. What is precedent? Precedent is an example. This is what it means. Precedent means an example, something that's happened before. And when we look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, it is a precedent for us. Allah tells us in the Quran, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Laqad kana lakum fi Rasulillahi uswatun hasana. In his life you will find a good model, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So Allah is telling us to study his life, in other words. Then Allah tells us the stories of the prophets in the Quran repeatedly. Some say 30 to 40% of the Quran is the stories of the prophets, to set a precedent for people like us, so that we can learn the histories and take lessons. Then Allah tells us in the Quran repeatedly, Siru fil ard, Fanduru kayfa kana aqibatul mukaddibin. Go in the land and see what happened to those who came before you. And then we cannot know anything about the Prophet ﷺ and his companions and their followers unless we study the history, which is what we call ilm al-hadith, and then followed by ilm al-rijal. Or ilm al-hadith is actually dependent on ilm al-rijal. Your hadith, science, your history of the Prophet comes through men, and these men, even these men we have to study. So the point I'm trying to make is that history is life. It is identity. It is your faith. If you don't study history, you're cut off. You are like a lost child in a great desert, without any navigation, without any tools for you to find the way. And what happens to such a child? Even adults don't survive in such circumstances. So that's why we have to study our history. I keep emphasizing this. You want to rise again? You want to taste the glory of Islam? You want to see Islam flourish as a global power, as a civilization, as a torchbearer of education, as a torchbearer of morality and ethics? You want your people to be great, your scholars to teach once again in global libraries and universities and institutions? Then you have to know what happened before you were born. What were the Muslims doing before? In that light, we will conduct this lecture today. Why are we talking about the British Raj? because it is directly relevant to the history of your ancestors. Your ancestors. When I say yours, I mean the majority of you. Majority of you are from the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, right? What we call the Indian subcontinent. Collectively, this subcontinent consists of 3 countries: Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Right? So your history, your ancestors lived under the British rule in India for nearly 200 years. So what is the British Raj? The British Raj is basically, to simplify, is the period when the British ruled India. Raj means rule in simple terms. Raj means rule, the British rule in India. So the British ruled India from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century for at least 200 years. In the first 100 years, parts of India, significant parts of India were ruled by the British, by a company called the East India Company. And it is a misconception that people think that this company was ruling independently without the British government or the ruling establishment of Britain at the time behind it. No, that's a misconception, because the East India Company was no doubt a business establishment. It came to trade in India as a company, as a trading entity, but later on it became a ruling entity. It had a private military of its own. It was directly supported by the British government of the time. British MPs, the British ruling class in Britain were directly involved in the profits of this company. In fact, 24% of the shares of this company at times, different times, the amount fluctuated, of course, but in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, late 1700s, 24% of the shares of this company were owned by British MPs. This is why it took so long for slavery to be abolished in the West Indies. Why was slavery not abolished earlier is a very good question. Atlantic slave trade was one of the most brutal episodes in human history. People talk about the Holocaust, people talk about other catastrophes, people talk about the Rwandan genocide and things like that. But do you know one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, one of the greatest injustices, one of the greatest disasters in human history was the Atlantic slave trade, whereby close to 100 million human beings were kidnapped from West African coasts, taken across the Atlantic Ocean, put into slavery and killed off. Only 6% went to North America. 94% of them went to Central America and South America. Their trace cannot be found. Okay? For 400 years, from the year 1450 to 1850, this trade continued. There are estimates that close to 100 million people were taken across the Atlantic in these 4 centuries. The minimum number is 11 million. The maximum number is 100 million. Anywhere between 11 to 100 million people were taken from their homes. And the Afro-Americans you see today in the US fighting for their rights to this day, under this movement called Black Lives Matter, are the descendants of those people, taken by force, against their wishes. They lost their identity. Their history was cut off completely. Some of them were Muslim scholars, by the way. Some of them were Muslim scholars, taken from West Africa, from places like Senegal and Gambia. They were Muslim scholars. There is a book I highly recommend for you all to study in this regard. It is titled Servants of Allah. Servants of Allah. It is authored by an American, Afro-American scholar. Her name is Sylviane A. Diouf. She has authored this book. That's not my topic today, by the way. The reason why I mentioned that was that the British MPs were already debating in the late 18th century to abolish slave trade. The reason why the abolitionists were finding it so difficult to do so, because many of these MPs had stakes in West Indies, in those plantations. They were making a lot of money from sugar plantations in the West Indies. And that's why slavery was absolutely instrumental to keep that trade alive. This is why people like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, and the list goes on, found it so difficult to abolish slave trade. Likewise, the East India Company and its atrocities were kind of, tolerated because many of the British MPs at the time had stakes in this company. So this company was established in the 16th century, late 1500s. In fact, in the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I officially, basically, you can say, initiated this company and gave permissions for this English company to trade. These were basically merchants using ships and vessels to go around the world to do trade. So this is how colonialism actually started. Okay? It started with trade. These European explorers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British, they went out traveling through these seas, and they found their way into these lands. They established colonies, they started trading with the locals, and they realized the locals are not being ruled by strong entities. Where they found the locals to be weak, they overpowered them militarily and occupied their territories. Hence, these colonies like Australia, South Africa, much of East Africa and Central Africa, okay, and India later on, not initially, because when the British came into India in the early 17th century, they had realized that the Mughals are far more powerful than they had encountered any other power around the world. The Mughals were a Central Asian dynasty established in the 16th century in India. The first Mughal emperor Zahiruddin Babur defeated the already existing Muslim dynasty called the Delhi Sultanate, okay, or the remnants of it. The Lodi dynasty was removed by the Mughals. Cut the long story short, he comes to power, and thenceforth the Mughal dynasty was established. The topic is not the Mughal dynasty, so I'm not going to go into the details. Just know that the Mughal dynasty was established in 1526 when Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, the first Mughal emperor, took northern India, or much of northern India, from another Muslim dynasty called the Lodis. So they came to power and they became more and more powerful. The third Mughal emperor, Akbar, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who was a very controversial figure, no doubt, he expanded the Mughal territories. Then his grandson, Shah Jahan, also expanded the territories. Then the son of Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb Alamgir, the most powerful Mughal emperor to sit on the Mughal throne, expanded the territory as far as southern India. He ruled 95% of India. He was the only Muslim king to rule that much territory in the Muslim history of India. Aurangzeb Alamgir, who ruled from 1658 to 1707. When he died in 1707 as an 89 years old man, having ruled for nearly 50 years, he left behind a very powerful India. Even though it was weakened by continuous war in the south, he fought rebels in southern India for nearly 25 years. And that weakened his state, no doubt, because the territory was too large. He never came back to Delhi, the city of Delhi, for 25 years. He remained in the south, fighting all these wars, trying to subdue Maratha rebels. He died in 1707. When he died, India was one of the richest countries in the world. His treasury was bigger than all the European kings put together. All of their treasuries put together. The treasure of Aurangzeb Alamgir, his possessions, the wealth he had, and the military prowess, and all things necessary to rule, his ability, his capacity was bigger than all the European kings put together. And India had 24% of global wealth. India basically offered 24% of global GDP. This is how rich India was. It was a powerhouse. It's very powerful. Very, very powerful. And a lot of people ask this question, that if India was so rich and powerful, why didn't they lead the world in technology like the Europeans did during the Renaissance? The answer to this question is that when empires are powerful, when they possess so much gold that they don't need to produce scientists to invent things for them to go and start looking into prospects of making money or bringing provisions, they just buy things. For example, you may be thinking, why don't the Qataris produce scientists, or the Sultan of Brunei, and these people are so rich, they just go and buy the latest technology. The best cars, the best jets, the best devices, the best phones, you name it, they have the money, they're going to buy it. So as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. Europe was very poor. Europeans were struggling. They were very, very poor in the 15th and the 16th century. This is why they produced many thinkers and scientists who were experimenting so that the people of their land can find ways to manufacture things, to have some kind of industry whereby they can become rich and prosperous. The Mughals were already very rich. So that's why they were buying European technology. They had European guns. They bought many, many European items. Whatever good or handy came from Europe, they possessed it because they had so much money. And they produced their own stuff. They had their own technologies, local technologies. India was supplying cloth to the whole world. The best cotton was coming from India in the world. As early as the Roman period, there are Roman historians. Pliny the Elder, he mentions that there was a debate in the Roman Senate that Roman women are so fond of Indian cloth that a lot of Roman gold is being shipped off to India to buy this cloth. So Indians were supplying cloth to the world up to the point when the Mughals were ruling. So what changed is the question. How did the British come to power? The British came to power simply by chance. By chance. It so happened that there was a vacuum left for them to fill, and they came and filled the vacuum. They could not, in their wildest of dreams, imagine to rule parts of India, let alone all of India. I will repeat. The British merchants, the British East India Company officers could not imagine ruling parts of India, let alone ruling all of India. And they managed to rule all of India, no doubt. So how did this happen? Very quickly, I will explain that when Aurangzeb Alamgir, rahmatullahi alayhi, passed away in the year 1707, his successors could not hold on to power. This is another topic in itself. It's a huge topic. You see, every single sentence, brothers, I will utter today in your presence has a book behind it. I'm not saying I've read all those books, but I'm trying to explain how vast this topic is. How vast the topic of the British rule in India is. How vast the Mughal history is. How vast each and every single region and the history is. So this is why I'm giving you snippets, glimpses into these vast histories. So what you will have to do is to go and read books so that you can actually learn more about this history and teach your children. And it is very important for you to know what happened in India. And what you face today in your countries, the reason you're sitting here in Britain is because you are economic immigrants. You are economic immigrants. Most of your parents came here to live better lives, whatever that means. They came from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India to live here, and other parts, maybe Egypt and Morocco and Algeria, depending on where you come from. You came here as economic immigrants, unless you are exceptions, right? And the reason why you sit here is because your countries do not offer you what you find here, right? Otherwise, you would be in your countries. You would be living with your relatives, your uncles, your chachas, your dadi and your mama, right? You would be sitting with them and have a bonfire every evening and have, those chats, in your villages. I don't know if you've experienced that, right? But you're here because obviously you find this place to be better economically. It suits your needs better. Now you are British citizens. You're part and parcel of this country. You are a very integral part of the social fabric of this country. But how did this all start? How did your countries end up in the state they are in today? Why is there so much corruption? Why is there so much poverty? Why are they in this state? You want me to stop? So this is a very important point. To understand why you are here today, you need to understand what happened before you were born or before your grandparents were born. What happened? What caused these circumstances for your parents and your grandparents to come to these countries and start working in factories, start driving taxis and start delivering pizzas? And in some cases, alhamdulillah, education came. You mashallah, made a good life here. Doctors, engineers, yeah. Allah forbid politicians, God forbid, okay, because we don't see any good ones, unfortunately, right? Yeah. Anything else is better, inshallah. Anything else, yeah, it's better to do something useful and something beneficial for your people than become a source of embarrassment for your communities. So that's why it's so important for you to understand the British Raj. So the Mughals declined. The Mughals, after Aurangzeb Alamgir, his descendants could not hold on to power. Within 50 years after his death, he dies in 1707. In 1757. He dies in 1707. In 1757, exactly 50 years later, a battle takes place in Bengal between the Mughal governor of Bengal, Nawab Sirajuddaulah, a young man in his early 20s, ruling Bengal, the richest province in the world, not only in India, by the way, the richest province in the world. Bengal was the richest province. Economically, agriculturally, Bengal was the richest place in the world, full stop, period. This is why the British were so interested in it. Bengal was the breadbasket of the Mughal Empire. When Bengal was lost, the Mughal Empire crumbled. It collapsed economically, financially. When you do not have agriculture or economics behind you, you cannot pay militaries, you cannot pay armies. When you cannot pay armies, soldiers, you cannot run a state. And this is what happened to the Mughals. So the British had established trading posts in the 17th century, having acquired permissions from Mughal emperors respectively, one after another. It started with Jahangir. Mughal Emperor Jahangir. So the early British East India Company officers, traders, got some permissions to trade at the port of Surat in current day Gujarat. So they established a trading post in Surat. They got permissions to trade. Then came Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. So they established more trading posts in places like Madras and Calcutta. So there were three main hubs of British activity as far as trading was concerned. Are you listening to me? You with me? It's going to get far more interesting, inshallah. We're coming to the interesting, the juicy bits very soon, inshallah. Okay? So that you understand what happened. So these trading posts were spread all over India. Surat is on the west coast. Madras is in southeast. Then Calcutta is basically the east coast, or the eastern territory of India. This is where the British established their posts. So they were trading initially in cotton. They were taking cloth and spices. Actually, cotton came later. The first incentive for the British traders was spices, Indian spices. There were no refrigerators in Britain at the time. To preserve foods, they needed spices. It was a necessity. In fact, it is estimated that cloves, you know what cloves are? You know what clove is, yeah? Long. Long, yeah? Let me say it in your language. Yeah? Long. Okay? Cloves were weighed against gold. This is how important cloves were as a commodity. This is how valued. You know, today you can walk into a shop and buy a kilo of cloves. Nothing, right? At that time, they were weighed against gold, brothers. Spices were so important for Europeans that they would travel from their lands, putting their lives in danger, go through all those sea storms and all sorts of difficulties, avoiding pirates and all of that. There was a lot of piracy. The Portuguese pioneered piracy. The Portuguese controlled the sea, right? The Mughals, they were weak in one thing, and that was they did not have any navy. The Ottomans did. The Ottomans completely occupied the Mediterranean Sea. So the Europeans could not do anything in the Mediterranean Sea. So they had to find routes around the Ottoman piracy. They had to find routes, the Ottoman Mujahideen, in other words, right? So they were, people like Barbarossa, yeah, very famous Ottoman admiral. And as far as they were concerned, they were waging jihad against these European powers, hostile European powers, okay? And this jihad of the Ottomans put the Europeans in a real funny situation. And what happened in Europe at that time because of the Ottomans is another, story. Even Queen Elizabeth I joined this jihad, right? She became an ally of the Ottoman sultans, those who were ruling at her time. There is a book as well. You should check it out. The Queen and the Sultan. Check the title out. The Queen and the Sultan, right? How the British Queen, because European establishment Catholics were against her. The church was against. She was a Protestant queen. The Catholics. This is why the Spanish King Philip II sent an armada of hundreds of ships to invade England in 1588. Hence the famous Spanish Armada, the destruction of Spanish Armada, 1588. You must have studied this history at school, right? Okay, so the Europeans are looking for alternative routes to trade. And they were looking, Christopher Columbus was looking for India. When he found Indians, or the Red Indians, they were actually not Indians. He thought they were Indians, right? That's why they were called Red Indians. The Native Americans were called Red Indians for a reason. Why are they called Red Indians? Is it an accident? What do you think? This is not an accident, because early explorers like Christopher Columbus and those who came after him, they thought these are Indians. This is India. We are actually in India. But India was thousands of miles away. They were in America. It took them a very long time to understand and realize this is actually not India. This is another territory, right? So Christopher Columbus was looking for a route to India. Why India? Because India was so rich. It was so powerful. It was the hub of spices and cloth and all sorts of things. It was the richest land in the world. And when the Mughals took it, the Mughals became the most powerful people in the world. And the Mughals did organize India as a powerhouse. No one could look at India. In fact, the British East India Company had a small dispute with the Mughals when Aurangzeb Alamgir was the emperor. They tried to mess with the Mughals, and then Aurangzeb taught them a lesson. He sent an army, and that army taught the East India Company a good lesson, and then they all came down to their knees and they said, please forgive us, let us continue trading. This is well documented historically. So they didn't mess with the Mughals again until they found their chance 50 years later. 50 years later, right? So these posts were established and the British were buying their time. They were doing the trading, spices, clothes, and they were getting richer and richer by the day. They had a good system going, right? But then there were rivals as well. There were the Dutch. The Portuguese had taken Goa on western coast of India, and the Dutch were also around. The French had also taken some spots in India. So there was rivalry between European powers, and they continued to fight each other for a very long time. But why did the British come on top? Is because the British managed to get their hands on Bengal. They got the richest province in India. So after the Mughal Empire lost its influence, mainly because of a Persian invasion in 1739, when the Persian ruler at the time, Nadir Shah, invaded in Mughal India and devastated the city of Delhi. So the spine of the Mughals was broken, unfortunately. They lost their prestige, they lost their ru'ab, they lost their influence, and since then, from 1739 onwards, the Mughals went down very, very fast. To the extent that nearly 20 years later, many rebellions happened. Many territories in India were lost from, the Mughals lost these territories. Marathas in central India, they started to take territories. Marathas were a group of Hindus, very destructive, very, very destructive. Although today in India, they are, hailed as heroes, some sort of historic heroes, and movies are being made about them. But they were the most destructive force India has ever seen. They did not discriminate between Hindus and Muslims when they committed atrocities. They were known for their destruction and wanton looting and raping and pillaging. They did not ask questions before they raped women. They raped Muslim and Hindu women equally. Marathas, who are hailed as heroes today in the movies, BJP, the current ruling party in India, is trying to create heroes while they don't exist, where they don't exist. They're trying to create heroes because the heroes don't exist. They're trying to fake heroes. They recently made another movie called Prithviraj Chauhan, all based upon fictional accounts. Fictional accounts, no history. There's no history there. Even the movie they made on the Marathas and Ahmad Shah Abdali, Panipat, is full of, it makes you, any historian who's a serious student of history, it will make his blood boil when you watch a movie like that. Okay? So, Marathas, they started to rise. So long as Aurangzeb was alive, they did not succeed in taking territories. They were fighting a guerrilla war against the Mughals. No doubt they caused a lot of damage to the Mughals, but they could not take territory so long as Aurangzeb was alive. Aurangzeb died. His children could not hold on to power for whatever reason, another topic. But then the Marathas in the mid-18th century start to come up as a huge power and a destructive power. Then the Sikhs start to take the Punjab. A lot of the territory in the Punjab region is taken by the Sikhs, okay, which is another history in itself, what happened in the Punjab. Then we have the Jats. The Jats are taking, again, another Hindu entity, taking a lot of territory. This is all happening in the mid-18th century, 1750s, 1740s, 50s, 60s, okay? These 2 decades, very, very important. A lot happened in these 2 decades, right? And then the British, looking at all this, in Calcutta and Madras and Surat, they're thinking, hold on a second, India is fair game. India is free for all. All of these groups are taking territory. Why the hell are we waiting? What are we waiting for? So, under the guise, basically the pretext of creating a private military to protect their own factories and or their own interests, they started to hire a private militia. And they started to train this military, mostly consisting of Indians, right? So they had a private military. While in India, a lot was happening at that time. Shah Waliullah Dehlavi in Delhi was watching all of this, a scholar of Islam, a very, very big scholar of Islam, Shah Waliullah Dehlavi. He saw what the Marathas were doing. Marathas were devastating Muslim territories. They were destroying Muslim villages, Muslim cities, they were invading and they were charging Chauth. Chauth was a tax they were charging. Chauth literally means 1/4. 1/4, right? So they would come into your territory and they would say, okay, where is our Chauth? Chauth literally basically, Chotha, from the word, Chotha, from the word four, right? So they were basically charging 25% tax on anything. And if you didn't pay, they would come and kill everyone, burn everything, rape everything. Okay? So Shah Waliullah, looking at the situation, he wrote letters to the king of Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Abdali, and he asked him to come and rescue the Muslims of India. Long story short, okay? Plus, Shah Waliullah had his own people pushing for this conflict because he wanted a conflict with the Marathas. He wanted to break the Marathas once and for all, and they succeeded. So in 1761, there was a battle called the Battle of Panipat in a place called Panipat. The Marathas were decimated in this battle by the Afghan coalition. These were Afghan rulers within India and from without India, from Afghanistan. So the ruler of Afghanistan at the time, Ahmad Shah Abdali, he came to India with his military, and then local Afghan rulers from northern India, such as the Nawab or the ruler of Rohilkhand and Nawab Najibud-Dawla, the ruler of Najibabad, who was also the prime minister, the Mughal prime minister at the time. All of these people, they joined hands, and Nawab Shuja'ud-Dawla, who was actually Shia, who was from the Persian stock, but the Afghans somehow convinced him to join them because the Afghans told him that if you don't join us, you will have to join the Marathas. And if we win the war, you will not be spared. But if you join us, and if we win, then you will be safe. So he had to make his calculations, despite the fact that he was a Shia and he didn't want to join the Sunni Afghans, but he joined for his own survival. And this was a huge, you can say, a Muslim coalition that fought the Marathas, and the Marathas were completely decimated in 1761. This is what happened. On the other side, in Bengal, when Mughals had lost power at center, a lot of these Nawabs, governors, Mughal rulers, they announced their independence from the center. They announced their own states. And this is why princely states in India came about. You hear the names of these states today, Bahawalpur, the state of Bahawalpur in current day Pakistan, or the state of Bhopal, or the state of Hyderabad in southern India, one of the richest states in the world. The richest man in the world was Mir Usman, who was the ruler of Hyderabad in the 1940s. So these states, princely states, came about as a result of the decline and the fall of the Mughal Empire. So the Mughals had declined at the center. The Mughal emperor had lost his power. Many sat on the throne and were either killed or moved from the throne by force. So this young Mughal prince came to the throne. His name was Ali Gauhar, also known as Shah Alam II. Shah Alam II, right? And I cannot tell his entire story here because that will be another lecture in itself. But I will mention him just passingly. He was the Mughal emperor on the throne when the British took the land of Bengal. And he himself was struggling to come to power. He could not handle the situation around him. and he could not consolidate the Mughal power to his benefit. Rather, he was losing more and more to all these factions who were arising in different regions at different times. So the British, to defend their interests in Bengal, the Nawab at the time was a young man who was very corrupt. I mean, I don't know why, for some reason in the histories of Pakistan and Bangladesh, he is seen as a hero, Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. He was actually a villain. He was actually a villain. He was not a good person. He was not a good man. In fact, he's one of the reasons why Bengal was lost to the British, right? So he had a vizier called Mir Jafar. So Mir Jafar was disgruntled. He was not happy with the Nawab, the young Nawab, who was a despot. So he pressed for taxes from the British. So the British said, okay, no taxes. So Nawab basically invaded the settlements and ended up killing some people. He put them in a very dark room. He crammed all the British captives in a dark room. And then not all of them died, but many of them died. But this episode, this particular incident was so inflated, so over-reported and exaggerated in Britain at the time that to this day, if you talk about the black hole of Calcutta, okay, Google it and you will think, wow, this must be a great catastrophe. It was a catastrophe, but less than 50 people died in this. He crammed these British captives in a room. They died of suffocation because it was hot, right? Many survived, but many died. And this episode was so inflated and over-reported in Britain at the time, okay, to gain sympathy for what the East India Company officers were doing in Britain at the time. They started to basically support what these people were about to do in the future. So the black hole of Calcutta was used to depose the then Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. So Clive of India, very famous, infamous personality in the history of India. Clive, who came from humble origins in Britain and ended up in India, Calcutta, serving for the East India Company, decided to take on the Nawab and his army. So long story short, Nawab's army was very big. It was 50,000 against 5,000 British soldiers. 50,000. There was no chance. The British had no chance. But because the Nawab was betrayed, as bad as he was betrayed by his own vizier called Mir Jafar. He betrayed him, and as a result, the Battle of Plassey in 1757 was lost. Okay, and Nawab had to run for his life. He was caught and he was killed. And then his vizier, Mir Jafar, was put on the throne instead of the Nawab himself. So he became the Nawab of Bengal, right? So that's why to this day in India and Pakistan, the Muslims or the Indians in general use this insult. If you want to insult someone, you say Mir Jafar. You call him Mir Jafar or Mir Sadiq. I'll come to Mir Sadiq later, okay? Mir Jafar. To the extent that the poet, he said, Jafar as Bengal, Sadiq as Dakkan, Nange Deen, Nange Millat, Nange Watan. Basically, he said that the Jafar of Bengal and the Sadiq of Dakkan, of southern India, basically they have no deen, they have no loyalty, they have no land, basically. So this is why these two names became, because of the betrayal, they became very infamous, right? So Clive he wins the battle, and clearly now they have the confidence the British never had. The East India Company have this confidence, having defeated one of the most formidable militaries in India, right? One of the richest provinces in India. They have defeated this. They cannot believe what happened. So now they have become more confident. So confident that now the East India Company wants to take on a coalition of Mughal militaries. So Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor in Delhi, and Nawab Shuja'ud-Dawla from Awadh, the state of Awadh, and Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Bengal, in 1764, they form a coalition to fight the British East India Company. in a very famous battle called the Battle of Buxar. In 1764, these two armies meet face to face. General Monroe is leading the army in the Battle of Buxar, and shockingly, three militaries of the Mughals are defeated. A coalition of three militaries from three different states defeated. And this was the end of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the richest provinces of India. Now the Mughal emperor, by force in 1765, under the Treaty of Allahabad, he had to relinquish the rights of taxation to the British in these provinces. The British, they could not believe their luck. They could not believe what they were seeing. They could not imagine this could ever happen in their lifetime. The East India Company is a trading company. Now they have become a formidable military power in India with immense money at their disposal. They became so rich that Clive, when he defeated Nawab Sirajuddaulah in 1757, that Clive, that one person, was given 250,000 pounds, 250,000 British pounds, equal, of course, in Indian rupees, but he was given 250,000 pounds as a present or as a gift, as a gesture of kindness from the new Nawab, Mir Jafar. And you know what that money was? Can you imagine how much that money was in the 18th century? 250,000 pounds. Can you imagine? How much was a house in Britain in the 60s? In the 1960s, how much was a house?
5,000.
Sorry?
10,000,
About 5,000 pounds. Just imagine. Go back to the 18th century. Clive became a billionaire overnight. Having won this battle, he became a billionaire. He collected all this money. He comes back to Britain, buys land, buys estates, and buys a seat in the parliament. You know, at that time in the 18th century, you could actually, if you had the money, you can buy a seat. You could actually buy a seat in the parliament. Okay, you didn't have to be elected. Okay, so the process of election was different at that time. So he bought a seat. But then he was impeached. He was put on trial for corruption, for acquiring all this money. So this Clive of India, he said to his questioners that I saw treasures in India beyond your imaginations. Vaults were open to me, filled with gold and precious jewels. And these Indian bankers, Hindu bankers, and Muslim rulers, they would basically pay anything for a smile from me. And yet, here I stand, being put on trial for being moderate. Basically saying, I'm quite moderate. What I brought back with me is trivial, it's nothing in comparison to what I have left behind. So they sent Clive back in 1765. Clive was sent back to India to sort some problems out. He comes back, and a result of his coming back was the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765. And now the British had their hands on power. They could not imagine money, immense money coming from Bengal, because all the factories, a lot of economics were taking, economic activity was taking place in Bengal. Cloth was being produced. There was rich agriculture. Bengal is, to this day, is agriculturally the richest province of India. Okay, so the British had all this money, and then slowly and steadily they started to expand their territory throughout India. They started to use rulers against rulers. They started to conspire. They got more and more arrogant. Firstly, in the 18th century, the British were heavily inspired by the Mughals, because the Mughals were very powerful. They had a very rich culture. They had rich art. They had rich language, rich poetry, rich philosophy. You name it. You look at Islamic manuscripts from the Mughal period, your head will spin. When you look at those Persian manuscripts written in the Persian language, Persian poetry of Hafiz Shirazi and some Indian poets in the Persian language during the Mughal period, is going to spin your minds. The philosophy those guys were writing, the works on theology, hadith and Quran manuscripts, gold illuminated, artwork, miniatures. You look at, and the architecture. If you look at the architecture, the Taj Mahal, everyone talks about the Taj Mahal, but if you look at other things they created, the Red Fort, okay, of Delhi, and the Badshahi Mosque of Lahore, and the Shahi Fort of the Lahore, and the list goes on and on and on. Mughal architecture, Fatehpur Sikri alone in Fatehpur in India is going to really, really, really inspire you. So the Mughals created all of this. They had a very powerful, rich culture. So these British merchants and their officers, when they came to India, they were completely mesmerized. They were blown away by this pomp and glitter and culture and richness. They got immersed into this culture. And they started to adopt the Mughal culture. They started to dress like Mughals. You would see white men in India in the 18th century walking around in Mughal clothes. Right? Nowadays you go to Pakistan, India, what do they want to look like? They want to look like the white man. Right? Because the white man is politically, economically dominant. When I say the white man, I mean the Western civilization. I don't mean in a racist sense, right? I'm not talking in a racist sense. I'm saying, it is like in a civilizational term, so they want to dress like the white man. Okay, but the white man at that time in the 18th century wanted to dress like the Mughal, because the Mughal culture was dominant, right? So a book has been written on this very topic by an English author, actually Scottish, he's not English. His name is William Dalrymple. William Dalrymple has written a book titled The White Mughals. The White Mughals. So if you read this book, he shows you how a lot of these English white men working for East India Company and for their interests in different courts of India were adopting the Indian culture. There was no reason to be proud and haughty against the Indians. There was no reason to look down upon them because the Indians are so powerful and so rich and so culturally vibrant. It is only in the early 19th century when the white man in India became racist, very, very proud, and had this sense of white supremacy and even religious supremacy. So they started to look down. When India was bled dry by the East India Company and its policies, when Indians actually became poor because of this foreign power that had occupied so much land, and so much intrigue was caused by this particular power, that the Indians, who were once upon a time the richest people in the world, became the poorest people in the world. From 24% GDP in the year 1700, even up to the year 1800, it is said the GDP was 23% of the world. But by 1947, it came down to 4%. Okay? When the British left India, over 90% of the Indian population was below the poverty line. So what did the British do for Indians, is the question. For 200 years, they ruled India. What did they do? So at this time, a lot was happening. So long as Tipu Sultan was alive, another freedom fighter, the British did not feel superior to the Indians. Okay, they were still formidable powers resisting the rise of British colonialism in India. Now the British had their eyes set upon the entire subcontinent. They were not satisfied with Bihar and Orissa and Bengal. They wanted to occupy all of India. So they started to cause intrigues within Indian states. So they started to cause the Marathas to fight the Nizam, and the Nizam is fighting the state of Mysore, and then the British are causing, basically, long story short, the British were causing a lot of problems within India so that they can weaken all the local powers and then overpower their territories, occupy their territories. And this is exactly what happened. But one power in particular was standing like a rock in their way. And that was the state of Mysore in southern India, ruled by a Muslim king called Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali was a soldier of fortune who rose to this very high position in the military of Mysore by, performing extremely well for the Hindu ruler of the state. And eventually he removed the Hindu ruler and he became the Sultan himself because he found him to be too weak. So he became the Sultan himself. When he became the Sultan of the state of Mysore, a principality of 33 villages became a powerhouse in southern India, ruling thousands of square miles, okay, nearly 40,000 square miles. This territory was carved by Hyder Ali. He started in 1760s, and by 1780s he was a formidable power. He defeated the British in major wars. The British saw no other threat in India other than Hyder Ali and his young son called Sultan Fateh Ali Muhammad Tipu, also known as Tipu Sultan, born in 1751, the correct date of birth, and he died or he was killed in battle Shaheed in 1799, right? So Tipu Sultan as a 17 years old joined his father on the battlefield, won many major battles. So in 1782, his father died of natural causes, right? And then he becomes a sultan. So the British fear no one more than Tipu in India. They don't fear the Marathas. They don't fear the Nizam. They don't fear the Mughal emperor sitting in Delhi at that time, Shah Alam II. He's already blinded. Okay, that's another story. They are looking at Mysore. And now Tipu is so clever. He's so astute, so shrewd politically that he joins hands with the French, who are also present in India for their own interest. At this time, the French Revolution was going on when Tipu Sultan was the Sultan. So he would read very enthusiastically about the French Revolution. He would get the French to bring the books of French philosophers like Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and he would read the philosophies, sitting in India in Mysore. And he had French soldiers, generals working in his army. He had French engineers teaching his men how to make weapons. So Tipu Sultan, in his factories, was producing top of the range, best weapons in the world at the time. In fact, it is recorded that he ordered cannons, guns. They were called guns at the time, cannons, right? From the French. The French came and they looked at when the delivery was made. They opened the guns and he said, "This is rubbish." Tipu Sultan said to the French engineers, "This is rubbish. This is not useful." They said, "What do you mean?" They laughed at him. They said, "This is the best product in the world. The French, they created this." He said, "Okay, let me show you the best product in the world." He took them to his own factories. They saw his guns, which were sold recently in a London auction, in an auction called Bonhams, okay, Bonhams. Check out Tipu Sultan weapons Bonhams. You will see, Google it. You will see his guns, his swords, his rifles produced in Seringapatam in India, in southern India, in his capital. The French were completely blown away. When they looked at the quality of his weapons, they said, "We cannot match this. We cannot match this." So the British themselves, the East India Company officers and rulers and generals and military men, they were saying, if there is a match for the British in India, it is Tipu Sultan. Long story short, in 1790, there was another war between the British and Tipu Sultan. 3 armies came against him, the Marathas, the Nizam, and the British. They joined hands. 3 militaries fought 1 ruler, and they took half his territory. He had to surrender 2 of his sons. He lost the war. In 1792, he had to surrender 2 of his sons and pay the compensation for the war. But then again, he did not stop his intrigues. He was even sending support to the American independence founding fathers. For example, Tipu Sultan was in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. Do you know who that is? Do you know who Thomas Jefferson is? One of the founding fathers of America. He is the author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was authored by Thomas Jefferson. Tipu Sultan was in correspondence with him. He sent his his embassy to meet with him in France. Tipu Sultan's embassy went to France to meet the French king. I think it was Louis the 16th. And then later on, when he was deposed, he had correspondence going with Napoleon Bonaparte. Tipu Sultan was corresponding with the Ottoman Sultan. He was corresponding with the king of Afghanistan, Shah Zaman, the grandson of Shah Ahmad Shah Abdali. He was communicating with all important figures, politically important in the world at the time, to defeat the British East India Company in India. Okay, and the British had realized through their spies what Tipu is up to. In fact, you wouldn't believe this, but it is fascinating that in 1784, if I'm not mistaken, there was a naval battle between American Navy and the British Navy in America, near the state of Delaware. It is called the Battle of Delaware, 1784. In 1784, right? 4 vessels on each side. 4 vessels on each side. The British had 4 vessels. The Americans had 4 vessels. And one of the American vessels was called Hyder Ali. It was named after the father of Tipu Sultan. So there's clear evidence that Tipu was in direct correspondence with the founding fathers of American independence. Why? Because he wanted the British East India Company to be harmed globally. He wasn't fighting the East India Company in India alone. He was fighting this evil entity around the world. Why was it evil? I know Isha time is up, so just give me a few more minutes, inshallah. Do you mind, brothers, I continue? And I'll finish, I'll stop, and then we can pray Isha, inshallah. Okay? So, he was fighting all of these British interests around the world, so the British decided that something has to be done once and for all. If we don't remove this man from power, we will lose India. There is a potential to lose India if we do not remove this man from power. Okay, long story short, in 1799, they bring the same coalition back, the Nizam, the Marathas, and the British, to defeat him, and they overpower him in this war, and he decides to fight and die in battle. His servants, his military generals, tell him, escape. There were many escape routes. He was a sultan. Many escape routes. He could go to another city within his state. He had many cities. It was one of the richest states in India, right? So one of his servants told him, Sultan, escape. And he said to him, have you lost your mind? Have you lost your mind? Have you ever seen cowardice from me? And then he fights and he gets shot a few times in his arm, in his side, and the bullet that killed him was in his temple. One of the British soldiers came, not knowing he was the Sultan, put his hand on the belt the Sultan was wearing, which was studded with gems. So obviously this was looting. So the British soldier, when the Sultan was injured, lying with other dead bodies, he was there. So the British soldier reached out for the belt, and when he tried to take the belt, the Sultan, with whatever strength he had in his body, he struck him with the sword again. Okay, and the soldier stepped back and shot him in the temple, rahmatullah alayh. Tipu Sultan died on the battlefield, fighting for his right and for his people and for his religion, most importantly. Okay, there is a book on him. It is titled The Tiger. Okay, and why he was called the Tiger, you have to go and read the book. It is by Kate Brittlebank. It is a very powerful book. It is a very good biography of Tipu Sultan. You can read it. So long story short, we're going to move forward very quickly. So the British, having defeated Tipu Sultan, they get this confidence now. They think, okay, now we are superior. Our religion is superior. Our race is superior. Our economic tactics are superior. Our military tactics are superior. We are superior people. And then there are philosophers in Britain behind them who are writing philosophies that kind of inflate this sense of superiority. So the British administrators British soldiers, British generals, British governor generals, they become racist. They openly express their racism and they start to marginalize Indians from all important posts. They put them aside. They don't want the Indians to have any important positions, especially after 1803. Tipu Sultan warned all these local Indian rulers. You fight against me with the British, watch what happens to you. You will all be enslaved one after another. One after another. And it rings a bell in our current day and age, right? So Tipu Sultan warned Nizam of Hyderabad, you will be reduced to a slave, to the status of a slave. The Marathas, the Peshwas, he warned them, you do not join me against the British East India Company, you will be reduced to the status of being slaves. And this is exactly what happened in 1803. Having defeated Tipu Sultan with the Marathas in 1799, 4 years later, the British defeat the Marathas in 1803 in the Battle of Aligarh, and they take the city of Delhi. In Delhi now, the last Mughal emperor, the last unfortunate Mughal emperor, not the last, the very last, the third last, you can say, Shah Alam II, who has already been on the throne for nearly more than 4 decades. So when the British take Delhi in 1803, the scholars of Islam are questioned now. And one of them was Shah Abdul Aziz, who was alive, the son of Shah Waliullah Dehlavi Rahmatullah Alayh. What do we do? The British have taken over, and what do we do? How do we? So he was of the opinion that India now, under the sway of the British, their dominion, because they are a Christian power, they have forced their way in, they have occupied Muslim territory. India is Darul Harb. India is Darul Harb. In other words, India is like a hostile territory now for Muslims. It is hostile territory. That's what he said, right? So even though he said there are freedoms, we are allowed our Eid, our Salah, other Islamic rituals are allowed, but we are under the dominion. This is a Muslim territory. So this is basically, because it's taken by a foreign occupying force, it is a hostile territory now, as far as we are concerned, right? So from 1803 to 1857, the next 50 years, almost 50 years, the British were becoming extremely oppressive repeatedly against the Indians, the Hindus as well as the Muslims. Muslims more so, because they were more in fear of Muslims than the Hindus, because the British East India Company knew that they have taken power from the Muslims, not from the Hindus. So the Muslims will always try to do something against our rule, right? Long story short, in 1857, the volcano of feelings erupts. How? And there's always that straw that breaks the camel's back, as they say, right? There's always that straw. You're not getting bored, brothers? Okay? We're going to finish very soon so that we can pray Isha, inshallah. So give me a few more minutes, right? So there is always that straw that breaks the camel's back. And the straw at this time was the British came up with this idea. And while all of this is taking place from 1803 to 1857, in between this time, the British bring in missionaries, Christian missionaries from Britain, from different British persuasions. They come in and they start to convert, or they try to convert, using the might of the government, because a lot of government officials working for the East India Company still up to this time, East India Company is ruling in name, okay? Even though a lot of the people who are ruling are directly linked to the British government in Britain, but still the name that's being used as the ruling entity in India is the East India Company, right? Okay, so the officers who are coming in, a lot of them are actually Christian missionaries, right? These people are being given high positions in the government. One of them, for example, is William Muir. William Muir was a very important figure in British India in the mid 19th century. Why is he important? Does anyone know who he is? William Muir. He was one of the Orientalists who wrote an entire biography of the Prophet ﷺ in 4 volumes. He wrote a biography of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in 4 volumes, right? Then he wrote other histories of the Muslims, like the history of caliphs, for example. And he was a Christian missionary. And the peak of all of this took place in 1854 when a Christian missionary named Fander, a German Christian missionary, was preaching in the streets of Agra. Agra was the Muslim capital, right? In northern India. He was preaching openly against Islam, challenging Muslim scholars. You know, your faith is a lie. It's all this, it's all that. He wrote even a book in the Urdu language called Mizanul Haq, challenging Muslim scholars. Muslim scholars at the time in India were not trained to deal with Christian polemics. They had no idea how to deal with this, right? Okay, so while Fander is going around causing these problems, backed by the government, no one can dare touch him. You know why? Because the British government is behind him directly. So the missionaries were sent into India, all over India, trying to convert the Indians. But these missionaries wrote specifically that Hindus, some of them from the lower classes, lower castes, they may convert. But the Muslims, forget it. There's no chance. They're not leaving the faith under any circumstances. So that's why they became more hostile towards the Muslims, the missionaries, right? And they always cause problems, as you know, probably even social media today nowadays, you can see what these missionaries are made of. Right? A bunch of liars, dajjals, okay, manipulators, all sorts of things, right? So they were no different then in the 19th century. So this guy called Fander, German missionary, he started causing problems. But Allah, when there is a Fir'aun or when there's a shaitan, there is also people working for Ar-Rahman, right? So when a shaitan like this is going around, there was a man called Wazir Khan. He came from India to Britain to study medicine. Right? So while he's studying medicine here, he starts collecting books on Christianity. He starts reading commentaries on the Bible. When he's reading commentaries on the Bible, look how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't know how Allah's people work, how Allah produces remedies. When there's a disease, Allah is also at the same time creating a remedy. So Wazir Khan, out of the blue, he comes here to study medicine, right? And he starts studying Christian theological commentaries. And then he gets exposed to all these catastrophes and disasters for the Christians, right? All the corruption of the Bible and, you know, the changes in the Bible and all the theological issues that came up. And Christians themselves were writing books to highlight these things. So he brought all these books back to India with him. So he met a scholar called Sheikh Rahmatullah Khairanawi. Okay? And he went to the Sheikh and he said, Sheikh, this shaitan is challenging Muslims. Why don't we debate him? The Sheikh said, I don't know anything about Christianity. He said, I know about Christianity. You know about Sharia. You are a scholar of Islam. I can deal with him on Christianity. Let's deal with him. So they challenge him. Long story short, there's a big debate and the British colonial establishment is very confident. All the judges, administrators, police, IGs, you know, inspector generals, and people like William Muir are present. They are like, we're going to watch Muslims getting devastated today in this debate. Yeah, they're going to be destroyed by this. Because he was very good. That guy, Fander, was very good. He couldn't find his match. So he was also very excited. But he had no idea that the pile of books they had brought with them, they're going to pull the rug from his feet. This is going to get blown away. So debate starts, and Wazir Khan and Sheikh Rahmatullah, they start to ask him questions about the Bible. Hey, hold on a second. You're attacking the Quran, no problem. We're going to use the same standard on you. So what about this? And Fander had no responses, completely dumbstruck. فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ Allahu Akbar. Right? And then that's it. Those administrators, judges, all those British officials, you know, they were completely blown away. They said, what happened there? And it became a cause of celebration for all the Muslims throughout India. The Muslims really pushed it in the newspapers. Everywhere Muslims celebrated that this debate was a disaster for them, and it was published. And a lot of scholars have even written on that debate today. So 3 years later, Indian mutiny happens. This boiled, you know, things like this. They boiled the blood of the people, and the British introduced new cartilages. You know, when back in the day when they used to use guns, they used to use these matchlocks. There was a packet for gunpowder. They would put gunpowder in the muzzle and they would put the ball on top and they would press it hard. I don't know if you've seen it, right? In some of those old movies, right? So they used to use those rifles, those guns. So they gave them cartridges. So to Hindus, they gave cartridges with cow fat. To Muslims, they gave cartridges with pig fat. So the Muslims realized what's happening. The Hindus realized. So the Brahmins, those soldiers who were in the British military at the time, and the Muslims, they both rebelled. It started in a place called Meerut in India, the rebellion. And the rebellion escalated to a level where all of India, nearly all of North India was taken in it, right? And the British East India Company, they found themselves in a very, very difficult situation, okay? And then this rebellion spread my own ancestors, my great-grandfather's grandfather was part of this rebellion in a region called Abbottabad in Pakistan, okay? He led a tribe himself, rahmatullah alayh, and he was captured later on in 1859 and he was put on trial, and 7 years he was put under house arrest in chains. He was sentenced to exile for 7 years, rahmatullah alayh. So all of this was happening in India at the time, and the British, they were completely shaken by this experience. Unfortunately, the rebellion did not succeed because it was not noble. These rebels were committing a lot of atrocities. Many scholars of Islam opposed what they were doing, right? They were actually killing women and children, right? There are examples like one of the scholars in Delhi, Sheikh Sayyid Nazir Hussain al-Dehlavi, one of the Ahlul Hadith scholars from Delhi, he found an English woman in a bush injured, crying, moaning due to pain. She was shot and she had some injuries, and he picked her up. She couldn't speak the language. The Sheikh couldn't speak her language. The Sheikh had his students. They picked her up. The Sheikh took her to his house, kept her for 3 to 4 months under hiding. And if the rebels would have found out, Muslims and Hindus, that the Sheikh is hiding an English woman, the Sheikh would have been killed with his family. Sayyid Nazir Hussain al-Dehlavi, a very big name, a very big scholar in the school of Ahlul Hadith. In fact, some unfortunate people use this example to taunt him, to use it against him. That how can you, astaghfirullah, what would you do in a situation like that? This is exactly what the Sheikh was teaching these people, that what you're doing is not jihad fi sabilillah. You're killing women and children. Now my own research when I did on that woman, because the woman's name was Mrs. Neeson. Mrs. Neeson. I found the name in the Sheikh's biography. I went and did some of my own research on that woman. I found records that 3 of her children were shot dead in front of her eyes. What she told later on. Okay? One of the children was in her arms when the child was shot. It was an infant shot, and the bullet went through the child and hit the mother as well. She couldn't tell all of this to the Sheikh. The Sheikh doesn't mention this in his biography, right? This comes from the British records, what I found on that woman. Subhanallah. So these are the kind of atrocities these rebels were committing. Not all of them, of course. There were some noble people outside of the Delhi area and the central Indian region, but this failed. This rebellion failed, and the British took their full revenge. The East India Company, they went on a massacring spree. They started killing, specifically Muslim scholars. They targeted Muslim scholars. It is said that there was not a tree from Delhi to Peshawar on which a Muslim scholar was not hanging. Okay? They blew people from guns. They tied people to the muzzle of the cannon and they blew them to make them an example. And then Queen Victoria, who was the ruling monarch at the time, she intervened personally when she heard about the atrocities, and she had to stop all the atrocities. And it took 2 years for the British to subdue the entire rebellion. Okay, and since then, from that point onwards, Queen Victoria took full charge of India. She became the Empress of India, and East India Company was removed from the picture entirely. So India became a British property. Shall we continue after Salah? Because okay. So I will stop now. I will continue inshallah after Salah. Those brothers who want to stay after Salah, please stay. Those who do not have time or you have to go somewhere else, no problem, no hard feelings. Please, those who can stay behind. Those who cannot, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for waiting. I apologize for taking longer than necessary, but inshallah we will finish the topic after Salah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I was talking about the mutiny. It is called the Indian Mutiny or the Great Rebellion or the War of Independence, depending on the perspective. It happened in 1857. I was explaining earlier, it was caused by a number of factors. And if I was to simplify it and put it in short terms, it was caused by a feeling of lack of satisfaction on the part of these soldiers who rebelled against their officers. Okay, so their pays were bad. They weren't paid good. They were being discriminated against. There was racism among British officers, and most importantly, their religion was being insulted. The Hindus as well as the Muslims, as I explained earlier, they used cartridges that contained pig and cow fat, and this is what really triggered the rebellion. Feelings were already high. Muslims and Hindus were already not happy with the way the British were ruling. From the year 1803, you can see what the pattern was of the East India Company, taking more and more territory, causing more and more intrigues, taking on more and more local principalities. If you did not toe their line, they would remove you. They would cause conspiracies against you, or they will conspire with other powers against you, and they will remove you in power. So if you toe the line, if you listen to the East India Company and follow their foreign policy, so what did they say to these local principalities? That you can rule yourselves, you can raise taxes, you can remain kings and princes and queens, but the foreign policy will be defined by us. We will dictate the foreign policy. Your foreign negotiations, you cannot negotiate with us, and you will have to have one of our political agents in your court present at all time. And he has to be aware of all the business you're doing. So basically they would plant one of the agents at every single Indian court for this agent to watch all the political maneuvering within the court so that he can report back to the Governor General in Calcutta, and then they would take appropriate action where necessary. This is why Tipu Sultan was attacked. This is why the Marathas were later on attacked, and this is why the Nizam in Hyderabad continued in his position or his descendants continued as the Nawabs or as the Nizams. Nizam was the ruling title. Okay, they continued as Nizams because they toed the line. They never challenged the British on anything. They said, okay, let us rule, let us govern. And so that's why those principalities that remained in power up to the year 1947, when the British left India, those powers remained in power because they toed the line. So those who did not toe the line, like the Sikhs, for example, were also removed. As I mentioned earlier, the Sikhs had taken a lot of territory in the Punjab, and in 1799, a young adventurer called Maharaja Ranjit Singh came to power in the Punjab and eventually took territory from Multan to Peshawar. You may be shocked now to hear this, but let me tell you that for 40 years, this man called Maharaja Ranjit Singh ruled territory in current day Pakistan, okay, and within India as well, in eastern Punjab. He ruled territory stretching from Himalayas in the north, from Peshawar, let's say, to Multan, all basically the best part of the Punjab. It was an empire, it was a Sikh empire. And the British, after taking Delhi in 1803, had their eyes on the Sikh empire too. They wanted one after another. They were going for every single strong principality and removing them from power so that they can have their hands in the pie, as they say. They didn't want anyone else taking any share, and it was all about money and power. India was a cash cow. As far as the East India Company and then the British Raj after 1857 were concerned, India was a cash cow. India was simply there to provide for the needs of the British elite, so to say. So that's why Indian merchants were taxed heavily. Their industries were completely destroyed to raise businesses in Britain. Where India was supplying cloth to the world in the 18th century, it came down to, by the year 1896, it came down to India not even being able to supply cloth within India. Only 8% of the cloth was produced within India for the Indians. So Indians started to import cloth from other places, most importantly Britain. So the British East India Company systematically, caused Indian economy to collapse. It took 200 years for the Indian economy to collapse. India, from being one of the richest countries in the world, became one of the poorest countries in the world. To use an Indian author's words, India, basically the subcontinent, collectively became the poster child of poverty in the world, right? Because of the British rule in India. So after 1803, when they took Delhi, they had their eyes on the Punjab. They wanted the Punjab too, right? But in the Punjab, there was a very strong Sikh army ruled by a very shrewd Sikh ruler, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was taking a lot of Muslim territory as well, and he was fought by the Muslims, no doubt, in the mountains, in the Kashmir Valley, the Muslims, including my ancestors again. This is part of my family history. That's why I'm so fascinated by it. One of my ancestors, he was directly involved in fighting Sikh armies when they came to take territory in the region of current day Abbottabad in Pakistan, right? And then later on, Sikhs were removed in 1849. Maharaja Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and within 10 years after his death, his sons could not hold on to power. One after the other, they were all killed off, right? After Maharaja Ranjit Singh came his son Khadak Singh, who was basically a drunkard. He died soon after. On the same day of the funeral of Khadak Singh, his son who succeeded him, called Naunihal Singh, was also assassinated and killed by the Sardars themselves. Then another son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh came to power. His name was Sher Singh, who basically ruled for nearly 3 years. He was also assassinated by the Sardars themselves. So these were court intrigues that killed off the rulers, right? And I believe partly this happened because of the oppression of the Sikhs. I'm not saying generally all the Sikhs, but this particular dynasty, right? It was very oppressive towards Muslims. I'm not saying all Sikhs were involved in this, because many Sikhs didn't like Maharaja Ranjit Singh as well, right? So his establishment was extremely oppressive. Now, sometimes people give examples of his, prime minister, for example, he was a Muslim, right? Or his treasurer was also a Muslim. His private physician was a Muslim, right? But that doesn't mean that all the Muslims living in the Muslim territory in the Punjab were happy under the Sikh rule. They were not, clearly not, because they were coming to India, in Delhi, complaining to the scholars of Delhi about this oppression, right? The oppression. And the result of this oppression was a group of people rising from the city of Delhi to go and liberate the Muslims of Punjab. And this movement was led by a man called Sayyid Ahmad Shahid, rahmatullah alayh. He was one of the students of Shah Abdul Aziz, the man mentioned earlier, the son of Shah Waliullah. So he came from the same school, same madrasa in Delhi. Sayyid Ahmad Shahid, he assembled an army, or let's say a private kind of army of consisting of volunteers from all over India. They went to Afghanistan and they attacked Peshawar and took Peshawar from the Sikhs, and then they started to take more territory from the Sikhs, and then unfortunately they were betrayed by the local tribes, and then they could not go any further. And in 1831, Sher Singh, the son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, basically massacred them in a battle called the Battle of Balakot, right? This ended that particular movement. But that particular martyrdom of many noble people who died in Balakot, it gave rise to Islam in India. Islam as an ideology was on the decline due to the British rule in India, but that particular sacrifice in 1831, it woke up the Muslims in India. Hold on a second, can this even happen? And it really revived the example of the Sahaba. how they gave their sacrifices, in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this movement is very important, right? There are books written on it. It is called the Muhammadi movement. It was called the Muhammadi movement, okay? And Shah Waliullah's grandson was part of the movement. He also was killed in Balakot in current day Pakistan, in the mountains. His name was Shah Ismail Shahid, who is the author of a very famous book titled Taqwiyatul Iman, right? So he was also a part of this movement. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because the British had caused serious problems for Muslims in particular in India. Muslims are now facing oppression at the hands of the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, and then they were being brutalized by the Marathas as well in those territories where the Muslims lived. So Muslims were completely scattered politically, they were completely divided. So they were really, and on top of that, for some reason, the Muslims were facing the brunt of the rise of the East India Company in India. In 1830s, the British government abolished the Persian language. You know what happens when you take a language away from a people? You lose everything. All the Islamic literature in the Indian subcontinent, as far as the Muslims were concerned, was in the Persian language. The Urdu language was the language of the masses. It was not necessarily a literary language. It was spoken by the masses. It developed in the 18th century, no doubt. Some of the best poets of the Urdu language were born in the 18th century. So it's a relatively new language in that sense. It's an old language, but in its literary form, it's a new language. Which was the old language? Persian. Spoken for nearly 800 years among Indian Muslims, starting from the time of Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznavi all the way up to the year 1800. So all the commentaries on the Quran, on Hadith, poetry, everything, books on mathematics, on philosophy, you name it, every single subject, on medicine, every single subject, Persian language. All the books were written in Persian language. So the Persian language was the power of the Muslims. And it was so popular and so needed that even the Sikhs and the Hindus had to learn the Persian language to do better in their lives. How do I know that? Today you pick up Sikh coins minted by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, they are in Persian. All the silver coins of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, even the coins minted by the Marathas, Hindu kings, in the Persian language. Their correspondence was in the Persian language. I have documents in my private library, my possession, coming from the Sikh courts, Persian language. So what did the British do? Very clever move. They abolished the Persian language as the language of administration. They replaced it with Urdu and Hindi. And they did this as a deliberate move to take away 600 years, if not 800 years of hard work of the Muslims. Okay? They took it in one stroke, 1834. And then they started to raise these new colleges. They started to attract the Muslims and the Hindus to their new colleges, okay, where they were teaching practical sciences, engineering and medicine. That's when the scholars of Islam in India, they became, hold on a second, what's going on here? They're trying to take away our youth. That's when these madaris came up, okay? These schools of thought that were born in India, okay? The school of Deoband, Barelawiya later on, okay? And then the school of Ahl al-Hadith. These schools came as a reaction to what the British were doing in India at the time. Okay, albeit in different places, created by different people, but these were the reactions of these scholars of Islam. And one of the reasons was that Muslims had completely lost their faith. They had completely lost any knowledge of Islam and Islamic history. So that's why scholars of Islam from different schools of thought, from different persuasions, they came together and they started working to teach theology to Muslims in specifically designed institutions. Okay, so they were not interested in the English language specifically on engineering and medicine. They were simply worried about Islamic sciences. so that our Muslim youth, our Muslim youngsters, our future generations are aware of the Islamic sciences. So it really pains me, my brothers, it really pains me when I see different schools of thought from the Indian subcontinent gunning each other down. They do not acknowledge each other's sacrifices. The Ahlul Hadith will turn and say to the Deobandis, you know what, our guys were the dons. They were doing the wars. They were fighting the British. They were the East India Company. They were involved in the Indian Mutiny. The Deobandis turn around and say, no, you guys are a bunch of traitors. You are a product of the British anyway, right? We are the ones. Our scholars went to Malta and they went to prisons and all of that. Okay. Then the Barelvis come along and they say, no, both of you Wahhabis are a bunch of nutters. We are the ones who are scholars. All of these names. This is where you are absolutely lost. You do injustice to your scholars and people who sacrifice for this deen. Okay? I say anyone who sacrificed out of sincerity, out of his love for Allah and His Messenger, no matter what school he comes from, right? If he sacrificed for the sake of Allah, leave his sacrifice to Allah. You don't judge. You don't judge. How do you know what Allah is going to do with him on the Day of Judgment? Okay? Start respecting each other. Start acknowledging the sacrifices. Wallahi, if I start telling you about the sacrifices of the school of Ahlul Hadith and the school of Deoband and some Sufi scholars, you will not believe it. Okay? The reason why I have sympathy for everyone is because I have seen the sacrifices of every single school of thought or people from different persuasions. They may not agree with each other. At times, they even attacked each other, these scholars. And they were wrong. They made mistakes. They were mistaken. When they attacked each other in these circumstances, they were wrong. We don't have to follow them in that. They were not masoom. They were mistaken. So when the scholars of Deoband were attacking the scholars of Ahlul Hadith, they were wrong. And vice versa. When the scholars of Ahlul Hadith were attacking the scholars of Deoband, they were wrong. Okay? Let them be. Agree to disagree. Let them love the Prophet and Allah in their own way. So this is what was happening. So British establishments were using this to their advantage. Right? So they got rid of the Sikhs as well. They annexed Punjab. In 1839, Ranjit Singh died. Within 10 years, in 1849, having fought 2 wars against the Sikhs, the Anglo-Sikh wars, okay, both of them were lost by the Sikhs and the British took the Punjab. And the last Maharaja, the surviving son of Ranjit Singh, who was a kid, they took him, they sent him to Britain as an exile, as a political exile. So he grew up here. His name was Duleep Singh. Okay, he grew up in Britain. Later on, he converted to Christianity. He was converted to Christianity. Later on, he rediscovered his identity and he went back to Sikhism. Okay, and then he tried to reassert his power, but then his story is another very sad story, which you have to read about. So all of this was happening. Then came the mutiny, and after the mutiny was crushed in 1857, the British had realized that they have to change their ways. They can't rule India just the way they were, being racist, being discriminatory, and just putting down Indians, not giving them any positions. So they started to change their ways. But Muslims were still marginalized. And I'm not just making this up. I'm not being biased here. I'm not just singing the Muslim song here, right? Okay. This is historically established that after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, Muslim community faced the wrath of the colonial establishment of India. And this is very clearly confirmed by one of the British authors himself, who wrote a book in 1871 titled, now listen to the title of the book, Are Indian Mussalmans? Are you listening? The title of the book is, The Indian Mussalmans, Are They Bound by Conscience to Rebel Against the Queen? I repeat the title of the book. Google it and you will see. It was authored by W. Hunter. The author was basically, again, a colonial administrator who wrote this book to make this very point, that the Muslims somehow are bound by their conscience to rebel against the queen, and there are reasons, there are causes for that, and he documents the causes. He first of all, he puts down some history of Muslim, Muslim intrigues and Muslim resistance against the British rule, and he talks about the mountains of Abbottabad and northwestern province of India, where the Muslims had gathered in some towns, in some places, and they were actually actively attacking the British forces non-stop, right? So he first documents all of that. He goes, look, these guys are doing this because they are influenced by an ideology, and he called it the Wahhabi ideology. So it's actually the British who coined the term Wahhabi. Okay? Those people who use the term today, the term Wahhabi, know that you are using a term coined by the British colonial establishment. They use this term to label the rebels, those who would not accept the British rule in India. They were Wahhabis. Okay? So you can find this in this book titled The Indian Mussalmans, Are They Bound by Conscience to Rebel Against the Queen? He wrote a book in 1871. Another edition was published in 1876. Now, what is he trying to say? The Muslims are marginalized. The Muslims are a problem. And then he gives causes as well. And then he gives some remedies as well, that we need to accept Muslims into the fold as well, because it's going to marginalize them further. It's going to cause more problems for us, or do something about it, right? So this book was written. Then in response to this book, another book was written by a man called Sayyid Ahmad Khan. He was an intellectual from Delhi, a Muslim intellectual, and he could see what was happening. So the Muslims were blamed entirely for the rebellion in 1857, or the War of Independence. Even though the Hindus were in majority in that particular war. Hindus, they were the majority. But the brunt of the wrath, basically all the burden was put on the Muslims. It was even called the Muhammadan Rebellion. Amazingly, it was given the name the Muhammadan Rebellion. So now what happens? Now Muslim intellectuals, they start to see the signs of decay within the Muslim community. The Muslims are being systematically deprived of higher positions in the government. They are not being educated. They are not given any privileges. They are being deprived, systematically deprived as a policy of the government. And Hindus are being given higher positions. Right? And this is documented historically, okay? So Muslim intellectuals see signs of decay within the Muslim community. Now Muslims may know Persian, they may know Arabic, they may know Urdu, but because they don't know the English language and they don't know how to deal with the British rulers, they will always be the miskeen. And the Hindus, they're becoming engineers, lawyers, doctors, administrators. They are being given higher positions. They will, always become the ruling class if Muslims do not rise to the task. So this is why Sayyid Ahmad Khan got together with some intellectuals, and they decided that they should establish a university for Muslims. So they established a school called Aligarh, or Anglo-Muslim College. It was called, in the city of Aligarh, Anglo-Muslim College, which became the Aligarh University later on, which is a very, very important institution in India to this day. Okay, so this institution was specifically established to educate the Muslims. So Muslims started to educate. They went to this university, they started to learn. They learned the history, they learned the English language, they learned other important sciences and arts, right? They became more and more aware. And the result was basically a group of Muslim intellectuals that came from this university who were theologically educated. They were very aware of their theology. At the same time, Shibli Nomani, Maulana Shibli Nomani is an example who studied at this school. Okay, even Iqbal, the poet, was a product of this school, not directly, but his teacher, Professor Thomas Arnold, was teaching at Aligarh University, right? So pretty much a lot of what happened later on, all the Muslim intellectuals were somehow linked to the Aligarh University. And this was a great deed done by Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who later on became a controversial figure himself. He started to, unfortunately, write things that were not appreciated by most orthodox scholars of Islam, and they started to disown his views and his theology. Theologically, he became controversial. He was actually, some scholars even declared takfir on him because of some of his theological views, but he did a lot of good work for Muslims. He tried to raise the Muslim spirit by educating them. So the result was a Muslim movement for independence. So in 1880s, the Congress Party was initiated by a collection of Hindu, Muslim, Jains, and Parsis. They came together, the Indians. They realized that the British are not giving us our due. We need to have proper representation. So Congress Party was launched, but there was nothing specifically for Muslims. But slowly and steadily, Muslim intellectuals realized that this is basically a front for the Hindus. Secular Hindus, most importantly, and maybe some theological Hindus as well, right? This is a front for them. This particular bunch does not necessarily represent Muslim interests. And if the British left behind a democracy, okay, then the Muslims, because they are a minority, they will be ruled by a secular or a Hindu majority, let's say. So they could see this coming. So Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan or Sayyid Ahmad Khan was the first person to see this. So he came up with this two-nation theory. Okay, it is called Do Qawmi Nazariya, two-nation theory. He said India basically consists of mainly two nations, Hindus and Muslims. So both of them, they need their separate homelands. They are two different nations. They're not one nation. Okay, they may be one geographically, they belong to the same territory, but as a people, they are distinct. They have distinct culture, distinct religion, distinct identities. Therefore, they are not the same people. The Congress Party, on the other hand, was arguing, no, we are the same people from the same land. So we are one. So those Muslim leaders who were very realistic, who had studied the history of India very carefully, they knew that if they are left under a rule which is not Muslim predominantly or does not have proper Muslim representation, they will be marginalized and they will be brutalized. Exactly what's happening in India today. Today, what's happening in India proves Jinnah, Iqbal, and Sayyid Ahmad Khan and all other Muslim intellectuals absolutely right. And those people who have been arguing for the last 70, 80 years that partition was a bad idea, it shouldn't have happened, Muslims would have been better off in a united India. You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't have a clue. You don't have a clue. You don't believe me? Look at India today, right now. Look at India today. Is your memory running out? So if you look at India today, it is ruled by an extremist Hindu ideology, okay, called the Hindutva. And this ideology does not bite its words, does not hide its intentions. They want to create a Hindu empire in India, and they want to create a greater India. They call it Akhand Bharat. Akhand Bharat means greater India, which basically includes Burma, Bangladesh, parts of Nepal, Pakistan, even Afghanistan. Okay, even Afghanistan. So we say to them, welcome. Okay, go to Afghans and make your Akhand Bharat. Yeah, okay. Go to Afghanistan and get your Akhand Bharat. Okay, so we tell these people, these fools, get real. Okay, you won't even cross Pakistan, let alone Afghanistan. Yeah, you won't be able to, even Pakistan, when you cross the borders, come on. So the point is, these kind of fools, they should not be allowed to rule. This kind of extremist ideology that is not realistic in its approach and its ideas cannot rule. You cannot allow them to rule. And this is exactly what people like Jinnah, Iqbal, Sayyid Ahmad Khan could see. They could foresee that this is a high possibility. This can happen. That's why they started to campaign for a separate homeland. they started to say there is no way that we will be successful as a community in a united India with these people. With these people. Okay, no doubt there were sincere people in Congress, no doubt they had good intentions. People like Gandhi, we give it to him. Gandhi was, in most of the things he did were noble. I mean, we don't agree with everything he did and said, but he had good, noble intentions. He wanted a united India, a good India for Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. But Gandhi was idealistic. Gandhi was not realistic. He was clearly ignoring the reality on the ground. In fact, he could see it in his life when there were riots taking place and when he went on a hunger strike in Bengal, right? Because there were riots going on. Hindus are killing Muslims, Muslims are killing Hindus, right? How this happened, how we got there is a very good question, and the British Raj had a lot to do with it. The divide and rule tactic and strategy, it always worked in their favor, and they continue to rule. The British, I believe, still would have ruled India if it wasn't for the two world wars. Okay, so what changed? The First and the Second World War changed everything. And the British were already taxing the Indians heavily, to the extent that the railway that was put in India to take all the important things to Britain and abroad, right? The railway was not put for the Indians, to benefit Indians, because the Indians were the poorest people in the world when the British rule ended in India. In 1947, 90% of the Indian population was below the poverty line. So how did that railway line benefit the Indians? It didn't. That railway line was an organized robbery. Okay? So this was, the British rule in India was organized crime on the government level, when the government itself was the culprit. So the British government at the time, I'm not blaming Queen Victoria here, I'm blaming her ruling establishment in India. Don't forget, these people, Victoria may never see them, and vice versa, right? So these people do their own thing. They are racist, they are bigoted, they are supremacists, white supremacists, a lot of them, including Churchill, right? Churchill, of course, lived later on, but he was one of those examples, and we will talk about him very quickly because I have to finish, right? So Victoria herself was a very kind-hearted woman. She was a very good woman. Okay, she had no idea most of the time what's happening in her empire. She didn't know what her people, her administrators are doing in India and in Africa and in Australia, okay, to the Aborigines. She had no idea, or in Canada for that matter, what's happening to the natives, right? She herself was a very kind-hearted woman, and there's a very touching story of Victoria and a Muslim servant of hers, right? She took him as a son. His name was Abdul Karim, and you must read this book titled Victoria and Abdul. They even made a movie on this, right? Victoria and Abdul. So this is a true story hidden from the world for nearly 100 years. How many people knew about Victoria and Abdul before this book was published? How many people? No one knew. Even I consider myself a serious student of history, right? I had no idea who Abdul Karim was until this book came out. I'm thinking, what? Abdul Karim, who is? So when I studied him, Victoria was learning how to read Urdu from him. He was teaching her how to write Urdu. In her private personal diaries, Victoria has written Urdu. Abdul Karim became so close to her that he was present at her deathbed. And he was like her son. You know, Allahu Alam, how sincere he was, how nice he was to her. She would, when he became sick, she would come to his quarter personally to ask about him. The family became jealous. The royal family at the time, a bunch of racist bigots, right, including Victoria's son, the future King Edward, right? They all became jealous that this Indian slave or Indian man, why is he so close to her? And most importantly, he's a Muslim. What the hell is he doing so close to the Queen herself, right? So they removed him. After Queen Victoria died, he was forcefully, brutally removed from his house, sent back to India. All the correspondence was burnt, and what remained of the story was somehow hidden by the family. Okay, and that information was used by this author who wrote the book, Victoria and Abdul. She was a very kind woman, and she stopped the atrocities during the 1857 mutiny, right? So she cannot be blamed. But the establishment in India that was ruling, the viceroys, the generals, and the administrators predominantly were a bunch of racist white supremacists. They had no respect for Indians. That's why people who rose as a reaction to this brutality, albeit social, political, economic brutality on the part of the British, the reaction was very hard. People like Gandhi. You know why Gandhi became Gandhi? Do you know what happened to him? Gandhi was an attorney at law. He studied here in Britain, right? He goes back to South Africa. He sits in the train where only white people could sit, right? So the conductor comes and he asks him, "What are you doing? You're Indian. What are you doing in this white box?" And he said, "Well, I'm an attorney at law." He said, "I don't care. You're an Indian. Get out." He threw him out. So Gandhi realized, hold on, why is this happening to us? Why is this happening to us? This is happening to us because we are a bunch of slaves. So he comes, long story short, for that you're going to have to read the story of Gandhi. He comes back, right? Similarly, Jinnah. Jinnah was an Anglophile or anglicized Indian Muslim. He came from an Ismaili family and later on changed his religion to Sunni Islam. How do we know that? Because he left in his will that his janaza must be led by Shabir Ahmad Uthmani, Mufti Shabir Ahmad Uthmani, who was, if I'm not mistaken, the grandfather of the current Mufti of Pakistan. Okay, also the grandfather of Mufti Taqi Usmani, right? So Jinnah left a wasiya, a will that my janaza should be led by this man. So Jinnah had changed drastically. A lot of people point to him and they say he was a secularist, he was an Anglophile, he was eating bacon sandwiches, he was playing pool, keeping dogs. No, you don't look at Jinnah when he was 30 years old or 40 years. You look at Jinnah when he was 70 years old, right? He was a very religious man by that time. And Jinnah was a staunch member of the Congress Party. It was later on when Jinnah realized that this party is not sincere with Muslims. So he left the party and he went back to Britain, became a lawyer, a barrister of the top magnitude, to the extent that he was one of the richest, one of the most successful barristers in Britain. He had an English chauffeur. For an Indian man to have an English chauffeur in Britain at that time was a big deal, right? Only princes could do something like that, right? From India. So Iqbal comes to Jinnah and asks him to lead the Muslims in their fight for independence because there is no sincere leader there for the Muslims. Iqbal found Jinnah to be that man. Jinnah goes back and he becomes the leader of Muslim League. Muslim League, according to some Hindu activists in India, it was established by the British as a rival to Congress Party to weaken the Congress Party, but that's not the case. And that may be true on the part of the British, may be true, but the Muslim leaders were not working for the British. They wanted their own objectives to be met. And their objective was to have a separate homeland for the Muslims so that the Muslims don't end up in a situation where they are today, where Muslims are being brutalized on daily basis. They are being told to say Jai Shri Ram or die. Their masjids are being attacked on daily basis. Their clothes are being ripped from their bodies. Muslim girls are being raped. And the culprits are not punished by the courts. The entire system, I'm not saying this, Rahul Gandhi, recently the leader of the Congress Party, which is a secular party, right? He said it, that we are not fighting against one political party, which is the BJP. We are fighting against an establishment because the BJP has planted its culprits and its agents in every single Indian institution. They have their people in the military, they have their people in the judiciary, they have their people in the police, they have their people in the municipalities, they have their people everywhere. And what is the goal? To clean India of Muslims, to cleanse India of Muslims. Am I making this up, brothers? Go and listen to the speeches of these BJP mouthpieces. Some of them are openly calling for a genocide of the Muslims. Openly. And this is not even a controversial statement to make anymore because it's so open. It is so well known, right? This is what Jinnah, Iqbal, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and other Muslim intellectuals could see coming. All the freedom fighters, all the independence founding fathers of Pakistan, they could see that if there is a united India, this is a high possibility. What's happening now is a high possibility. And lo and behold, what they feared has come to pass. This is exactly what they feared, that Muslims will become second-class citizens in India with no protection. And in fact, when the partition happened in 1947, Jinnah said, now the Indian Muslims will spend the rest of their lives proving their loyalty to India. Unfortunately, this is what's happening today. A lot of Indian Muslims are pressurized into saying things to prove their loyalty, that they are loyal to India as citizens. This is absolutely absurd. This is crazy, right? So this is why they went for a separate homeland. Long story short, the British Raj basically came to an end after their racist and bigoted rule of 200 years. First 100 years of taking territory within India, annexing state after state, territory after territory, getting their clutches onto the territory. And once they had their clutches onto the territory, they started to drain the country dry. In conclusion, the 200 years rule of British East India Company and the British Raj over India costed India $45 trillion. From the year 1765 to 1938, it is estimated that Britain took $45 trillion from India, which is 14.5 times the economy of Britain today. Are you listening? Which is 14.5 times the economy of Britain today. This is how much. What you see in London, in central London, all those buildings, all those lavish, big, Victorian churches and everything, where do you think this money came from? Where do you think this money came from? Okay? All these Victorian buildings, magnificent, monuments and structures. India was bled dry. From being one of the richest countries in the world, it became one of the poorest countries in the world. There were massacres, there were famines, man-made famines. 30 million people died in these 200 years directly due to the British ruling policies. There was a famine in 1770s, 6 million Bengalis died in that famine. Directly as a result of the policies of the East India Company. Then there were famine in the 19th century, from 1870s to 1890s. Okay, millions died in those famines. And last but not least, 1943, the famine, which was not caused by Churchill. Churchill did not cause the famine, but he definitely escalated the death toll by directly not sending food to those people who were starving to death. 170,000 ton wheat came from Australia, docked at Calcutta. It was sent to Britain because it was needed for the Europeans. It could not be fed to Indians. Churchill was repeatedly warned about the upcoming catastrophe. The famine had started to show in 1941. But the reason why 1943 is mentioned as the year of the famine, because that's when the death toll rose to 4 million people dead. 4 million people. Directly as a result of the policies of Winston Churchill, who's found on the back of the £5 note. I don't know why. I don't know when this world will wake up, when we will actually realize that we cannot glorify people like this and see them as our heroes. Churchill specifically wrote when he was told that people are dying in India right now due to the famine. He said, when will Gandhi die? He wrote on the paper, on the report that was sent to him, in the margins, when will Gandhi die? Then he said about the Indian people, these are a beastly people with a beastly religion. It is their fault they are dying because they breed like rabbits. These are the words of Churchill. I'm quoting word by word. Winston Churchill. Right? So, 1943, 4 million Bengalis died as a result of that famine. Okay? It is estimated 1.8 billion Indians died during this 200 years rule of the British East India Company and the British Raj. 1.8 billion people died as a result of this rule. Okay? It is estimated. I don't know how correct that estimate is. During the First and the Second World War, India gave millions of soldiers to fight for democracy and freedom and honor of Britain. In the First World War, 1 million soldiers came from India. Close to 100,000 of them died. About 1/3 were Muslim. Did you know that? Did you know that? Hundreds of thousands of Muslims, they put their lives at stake for the freedom and the honor and the survival of Britain. These people have an audacity, some of these politicians and these bigots, to point a finger at Muslims and say that you Muslims are parasites, you've come here to do this and do that. Okay, they can never pay the Muslims back. Never. In the Second World War, 2.3 million soldiers given by India to fight for Britain. Hundreds of thousands of them dead. How do I know this? You know, when soldiers died in the First World War, the British government actually gave plaques made of copper, this big, like a plate. On those plaques, it was written, he died for honor and freedom. He died for honor and freedom, and the name of the soldier is there, Muhammad Amin, Qasim Khan, Muhammad Asad. For example, I have those plaques in my personal possession. I have collected some of them. Okay, and where do you find them? You go to Pakistan, to one of the scrap yards, and you will find them being sold in scrap yards. Families just, 3 generations down the line, no one cares what the old man did. And the old man died. He died for the honor and freedom of Britain. 1 million of those plaques were given to soldiers because 1 million died, because those were only given to those who died. Bronze plaques. And then medals were given to those who survived, silver medals, and on the rims, the names were inscribed. Each and every single one of those medals were personalized, given by King George to the soldier as a token of gratitude for taking part in this war. And who was paying the cost? The Indian men, including Muslims, and Indian people who were taxed. 2/3 of the expense of this military was coming from Indian taxpayers, not British taxpayers in Britain. This was the British Raj in India. And I can talk about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, April 1919, when one of these racist British generals, his name was General Dyer, who ordered to shoot armless people, harmless people and armless. People who had no weapons, they were protesting there, and it was the day of Baisakhi, the celebration of the Sikhs. Men, women, and children, they were shot dead. Casualties, they amount to, some people say, according to the British, 370, according to the Indian witnesses, 1,500. According to General Dyer's own confession, 1,650 bullets were fired into the crowds, and none of them was wasted. Not one bullet was wasted. General Dyer was put on trial and acquitted. In fact, the House of Lords praised him for the great job he did for the empire. Jungle Book, Mowgli, You know who wrote it? Kipling, right? You know Kipling? Jungle Book, Mowgli? Yes? You know what he said? He said he saved India. General Dyer doing this saved India. So this was basically the legacy of the British rule in India. So when the British left India in 1947, India was one of the poorest countries in the world from being the richest when they took over. Right? And then it doesn't stop there. During the partition, one of the greatest catastrophes took place, which was the partition of Punjab. Okay, 1 million people died as a result of migration, forced migration. Muslims coming from the Indian side to the Pakistani side, and Sikhs and Hindus going from Pakistani side to the Indian side, and in between, thugs, bands of thugs and robbers and rapists were on the loose. Over 100,000 women were kidnapped and forcefully married to their kidnappers and rapists, their rapists. And 1 million people lost, over 1 million. A rough estimate, a conservative estimate is that over 1 million people died in this forced migration within the territory of the Punjab. This happened in 1947, August 1947. I have met a woman myself. This is me, an eyewitness. I wasn't even born then. I was born 40 years later. But I met an old woman in the mid-90s in the Punjab, in the city of Jhelum. And I saw this old woman, a very kind, compassionate woman. Allah have mercy on her, because I'm pretty sure she has passed away. She was very old then. She had 3 missing fingers. I asked her, what happened to you? How did you lose these fingers? She took a deep breath and she said, I had a son who was a teenager. During the partition, some drunk Sikh men came into my house by force and they killed my son in front of me. And then one of them asked me for a pot, to hand the pot over to him. And I basically stretched my hand and he struck my hand with a sword and I lost 3 of my fingers. These 3 fingers are lost at that time. This is, a victim of that violence who I met personally. My own grandmother told me that she saw blood running through the sewage canals of the city of Jhelum. Atrocities took from both sides. We have to be fair. The Muslims were doing it. Those thugs, those bands of, cruel, criminals from this side and from that side, both, sides, they were committing atrocities. And there are many noble examples of people saving lives too from both sides. Many noble examples. Many people gave refuge to Sikhs on this side in Lahore, in the city of Lahore and other places. And on the other side, many Hindus and Sikhs gave refuge to Muslims. But the majority had lost the plot. And this was all caused by the administration. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, who was himself a pervert. Later on, it was shown in British newspapers, actually, articles were published that he was actually, into young boys who would come into the Navy because he was a naval officer, right? He would take advantage of his position and try to have relationships with younger naval officers with them, okay? Use his position. I mean, these are articles published in the British newspapers. I'm not making this up, okay? His wife had an affair with Nehru, right? Who was also a Congress leader. While Gandhi may be sincere, but Nehru was clearly not right in the head. He was having an affair with the wife of the last Viceroy of India with his knowledge. In fact, there's an interview I watched myself. It's on YouTube. The daughter of Lord Mountbatten, she confesses that my mother, Edwina Mountbatten, had a relationship with Nehru. What was the nature of this relationship? She said, I'm not clear, but they clearly had some kind of intimate relationship. And this is why the partition of India and Pakistan was messed up by this relationship between Nehru and the Mountbattens. And the Muslims were basically, not given their due. What was due to be given to them, a lot of it was taken on the very day when partition was announced. And this very man, Mountbatten, came to Pakistan, to Karachi, on the 14th of August, when he delivered the speech for the independence of Pakistan and handing over Pakistan to Jinnah as the Governor General. In his speech, he said that the Muslims of Pakistan have a model in Akbar, the Mughal emperor. Jinnah comes back. He says, no, we have a better model than Akbar. We have Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to follow. So, this was the doing of the British Raj in India. The lecture has gone on for longer than I thought, but there's a lot of detail to cover, brothers. What I shared with you today is not even tip of the iceberg. Okay, you may be shocked by some of these details, but let me tell you, what I shared with you is not even the tip of the iceberg. Start reading books, okay? Not by apologists of the Raj, but those who have actually written down the real impact of the Raj on the Indians and the Indian subcontinent, okay? One book I would strongly recommend is titled Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor. Okay, Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor. It's a good book to read on that very topic. Okay, and the books of William Dalrymple, one of them is The Anarchy. Okay, the Anarchy, basically Anarchy. Okay, that book, read that book, and then the other book is White Mughals, and there's another book by him titled The Last Mughal, and another book is Return of a King, and it is about the British invasion of Afghanistan in 1839, 1840 and 1841, and he documents what happened during that invasion. Return of a King. 4 of his books, absolutely amazing, must-reads to understand what's happening in India at that time during the British rule. Absolutely amazing books. Okay. On that note, I will stop. Yes, sorry. First book was The Anarchy. Okay. Then The Last Mughal, The White Mughals, and then Return of a King. Return of a King. Okay. On that note, I will stop my lecture for today. Thank you so much for listening. And inshallah, we will go to Q&A. Jazakumullahu khairan walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And every single thing I said today, brothers, I can substantiate it with evidence. I can give you references of the books, but I don't want to exhaust you with references. But I put a lot of history into one lecture, so you'll have to go and start doing research on these topics, Googling these topics and Googling these names. Google the names and you will see a lot more references and details and sources, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.